Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We are in the final Target book of 1982. Following the release of Doctor Who and the Sunmakers in November of that year was a nearly 6-month gap. When the books resume in 1983, they will be numbered sequentially, and there will be a disconnect between the paperback release date and the hardcover release date. I'll talk about that a little more next week. We will be going, for the most part, in paperback release order, and I will be keying the books to their paperback release date, which in many cases is several months after the hardcover release date. But again, this is a paperback show. I'm a paperback collector. I do not really concern myself with the hardbacks. I would point you instead to my friend Larry Van Mersbergen, who runs the Doctor Who Collectors podcast. That is the premier podcast of the Doctor Who Direction Point podcast network. Larry does an episode every couple of months or so talking about all of the Doctor Who hardcover novelization releases for any given year. He is usually joined by another friend of mine, Tony Witt. Tony, of course, does the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, which is what this show does, except in story order rather than publication order, but has been going on for much, much longer than mine, and my show would certainly not exist without his. But again, starting in 1983, the hardbacks come out earlier. We will be talking about the books in paperback release date and paperback release order. This week, for the last of the 1982 novelizations, Louis Baston is back. Louis joined us all the way back in episode 20 for Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion. Louis is the premier expert on the Sunmakers, the TV episode. We are going to have a terrific and slightly longer than usual time talking about the Sunmakers, the book, the Sunmakers on TV. Note that there are slightly different titles for each one. We're going to talk about the symbolism and the inspiration on TV. We're going to talk about his Black Archive. We're going to talk about Fritz Lang. We're going to talk about Star Wars. We're going to talk about everything, and we are going to play a game at the end. We are coming up, of course, on my Five Doctors shows. The Five Doctors was the last Target book of 1983. And that will be the final episode of our 5th season, which covers the 1982 and 1983 books. Because the Five Doctors is so big and because I love it so much, we are going to devote 2 full episodes, one to the novelization, have an incredible guest lined up for that, and then one to the TV story. We have a panel of guests, and of course, I invite you all to get in your submissions. I have received some great ones already, 2 to 5 minutes long, talking about any aspect of the Five Doctors you wish. And you can reach me in one of 2 places. The show email is Doctor Who Literature. That's drwholiterature@gmail. And of course, you can also send it to me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, drwho Novels. Either one of those places should work just fine. In other show news, we talked last week about the first negative review that I got on Apple Podcasts. I'm very, very proud of that. And that was the one that described some of my guests as, quote, ghastly, woke zombies. Well, show contributor and producer and general all-around great guy Jim Sangster has gone ahead and designed a ghastly, woke zombies t-shirt. I will post the link to that on Redbubble. Now, this is not a monetized show. I will never charge you. I use free services for the recording of the show and the distribution of the show, and I am not ever going to monetize this in any way, shape, or form. This is a non-Patreon show. I am not asking you to purchase Jim's t-shirt, the Ghastly Woke Zombies shirt, in order to support the show. However, it is a great shirt. I'm getting one myself. I will be wearing that at conventions. It is just, a great design and a great message, great way of supporting the show. I also want to give a shout out to Brian Burkhart, longtime friend of mine from the Northeast Doctor Who convention circuit, who was listening to my back catalog and heard my comment in the Invisible Enemy episode talking about wanting to have a Roomba only if I could have a canine attachment. Well, Brian, who's very creative, went ahead and did just that. He put an actual canine prop on top of a Roomba. And I put some video of that from Brian's Twitter feed, and that was shared on mine. That was all posted within the last week. That came out the same day that Jim showed me the design on Redbubble for the Ghastly Woke Zombies t-shirt. So, a lot of really, really good stuff going on. The Doctor Who literature podcast army is very, very, very creative, and I am just very, very proud of you all and very happy to have you as my listeners. Very happy to see what incredible stuff you came up with. That was episode 47, by the way, where we discussed K9 and the mythical Roomba, which is now reality. Anyway, there's a lot to get to this week. We have a great interview, and then I have my breakdown of the text of the novelization. Let's get to it.
A Whovian and a Nuvian walk into a TARDIS.
And explore every episode of the classic Doctor Who series.
Join me, podcaster John S. Drew,
and me, writer-editor Jim Beard, as we take apart each story starting from the very beginning in 1963.
And join us on our Facebook page and Twitter, where we continue the discussion with you with historical artifacts from British papers of the time. The Doctor's Beard podcast, released every Saturday around tea time on your favorite podcasting app.
And we'll see you in time and space. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature. Keep turning the pages.
Doctor Who and the Sunmakers is a fascinating novelization, especially coming hard on the heels of Christopher H. Bidmead's Logopolis, which in many ways is an elevation of the form. Terrence Dicks's adaptation of The Sunmakers on its surface is a slightly more traditional novelization. But as we'll talk about later on in the program when I read out my audio essay, there's a lot of fascinating turns of phrase and intentional deviations from the television story and all sorts of other allusions to other great works of literature. Sunmakers on television is a very, very sharp-witted and subversive story, much of which may well have gone over the head of its target audience in 1977. But there's a lot to unpack about the Sunmakers, the television story, as written by the great Robert Holmes, and one might say that the definitive book could be written about Sunmakers. So for this week on Doctor Who Literature, I have literally tracked down the man who wrote the definitive book about the Sunmakers. We are happy to be rejoined for the first time since episode 20, The Dinosaur Invasion, by the author of Black Archive number 60, The Sunmakers, Mr. Lewis Baston. Lewis, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be back and discussing another sort of political Doctor Who story. Perhaps some people may feel the special effects in the Sunmakers were lagging behind the quality of the political subtext as they were in Invasion of the Dinosaurs, but I'm sure we'll go into that.
The Sunmakers benefits from the fact that there is only one brief shot of an alien creature, and everything else can be filmed on location or in your standard sets with humanoid or humanoid presenting actors. So it certainly does not have the CSO problems for which Invasion of the Dinosaurs is most unfairly remembered. But Sunmakers is, as I alluded to earlier, a story with lots and lots of political subtext. And there is this complaint that modern-day Doctor Who is too, quote-unquote, woke, whatever that's supposed to mean. And I read an accusation on Twitter this morning that Russell T. Davies is more interested in pushing an agenda than telling a story, which, if that's the case, basically invalidates the entirety of the Doctor Who canon, going back to the Cave of Skulls, Doctor Who's second ever episode, which is all about choosing who is going to be the leader of your nation. So let's get you some time to overtalk me here. How did you first get involved with the Black Archive series, and how did you choose this particular story to write about?
Right, Black Archive. I'd sort of admired them from afar for a while. They are terribly good and detailed, and each author has their own sort of approach and method of getting to grips with it. But it's actually quite kind of it's quite rigorous. It's quite sort of a academic grade quality, but we're talking about something fun. So I hope that also comes through, and it's something I admired in the series. And friend of mine from way back, Matthew Kilburn, had written for it, and his book on the Time Warrior was fantastic, I thought. And it was during COVID. 2020, it was open for pitches for people who wanted to write about particular stories, and I thought, well, I would quite like to do this. And the Sunmakers for me was the obvious story. I'm fascinated by the 70s. It was a story about which there is still debate about its meaning, and I won't claim to have closed down that debate with my own contribution, even though I think I make a pretty good argument for one side of that debate. And it was a story I remember fondly from my youth as well. It is one of the first stories I have any kind of visual memory of Leela and of the collector and all the sort of pompous costumes and things that the gatherer has in the Sunmakers. So a lot of things came together, and because of the COVID lockdown, a lot of other projects ceased as well. So I had time. So it all came together, and I wrote it in quite a hurry in 2020. And then the editorial process kind of took another while after that. And so I was in the ironic position that the British tax authorities actually paid me to write the book through the lockdown grant. So I'm very grateful to that, and I dedicated it to the good men and women of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which I
Praise the company.
Praise the company, indeed, citizen. So I hope somebody at the tax office found that amusing.
How old would you have been when you first saw the Sunmakers? Because obviously there is a lot to enjoy about the story from a purely surface perspective. It's a canine story, so that automatically puts it in my top 25. Canine makes everything better. You have two, not just one, but two very larger-than-life human villains who give very, very careful performances that are aimed at a specific portion of the viewership. So you have the Gatherer, who has a colorful costume and speaks in very plummy tones and is sort of intentionally stupid.
Yeah.
A very smart character, but presents as very stupid with the things he says. He's easy to laugh at. And then you have I don't want to talk a little bit more about potential negative aspects of the collector's characterization.
Sure.
But again, Henry Wolfe gives a very intense performance, and it's very memorable when you're a kid, even if perhaps the larger points of colonialism and overtaxation and the perils of end-stage capitalism might not be quite obvious to the viewer under the age of 16. So how old were you when you first saw Sunmakers, and when did you first start to try and unpack the political and economic ramifications of the story?
Well, I was 6 when I first saw it, so it was an adventure story, and the sort of what you said about the kind of large nature of the characters and the performance of the villains, I think must have drawn me in a bit. And also there is this quite nice narrative, this quite nice thread through it of basically Cordo, who's your central figure on Pluto, this sort of downtrodden worker. It's a story of his kind of liberation from this and his personal journey, and the way that the Doctor and Leela kind of liberate him from his own fears as well as from the company. And so there's this nice story. It's mostly Leela and Cordo who kind of deliver this. And you got some quite sort of scary grotesques in terms of the cellar dwellers, the rebels against the company. So I think I just enjoyed this slightly kind of lurid, turned up to 11 kind of stylized thing. And there is sort of... when did I start thinking about the politics of it? Probably after I got the novelization a bit later. The novelization, I'm sure we'll talk about this, was 5 years effectively after the first transmission. And so I'll have got that. And there's some sort of notes in the in the novelization. I was getting more interested in politics by that stage. So it struck me that, and also sort of reading about it in fan stuff that was getting going in the 80s, sort of Doctor Who weekly, monthly, and being aware of the sort of fan lore about this program, and looking back on it when you're kind of, by the time I was sort of 14, 15, I guess I probably was aware that this was kind of the political one from that series. And it was very much the series when I was becoming kind of caught up in Doctor Who. I plunged quite quickly into watching the series fairly religiously, and my peak fandom was probably sort of 1980 to 83, as were 84. So yeah, I became kind of exposed to the more kind of political side. Then I had a sort of fallow period from Doctor Who, from the sort of late 80s to the revival that Russell T Davies kind of oversaw after 2005. And so I guess then also I started to think about it in terms of it's sort of history, as it were. I did think for a while it might be quite fun to write a kind of general history of the 70s, and I've always been interested in late 70s stuff. I think it was a fascinating moment for culture and so on, not just in its kind of highly political aspect as you see in the Sunmakers, but generally. I mean, there's this sort of odd stylishness to Britain in the late 70s, which contrasts with its kind of shabby reputation. And I was never a Thatcherite. I was always as a kid even sort of trying to kind of make the unfashionable argument that sort of Britain in the late 70s wasn't such a bad place, and you have this thing, the Sunmakers, a story I liked that had the reputation for being a kind of very sort of conservative text at stages, and there was this discussion fueled by the complete ambiguity of the text in a number of places about where its politics really lie. So sorry, that's a very long way of saying that I sort of gradually feel I learned more and more about the politics of it as time went on. And when I came to write the Black Archive, that plunged me even further into it. I mean, I hadn't realised quite how much of the original anti-colonialist idea was still there in the text. That it was about taxes only on the most superficial level, and that there's something else there. And of course, as one grows into fandom and grows up, you're aware of the reputation of writers, and Bob Holmes obviously being a political, cynical, very clever writer. It was quite fun finding probably some jokes that he'd put in there that had lain there like kind of ungerminated seeds for 40 years that perhaps I'd never seen anyone kind of remark on before I just started looking really deeply at it.
It is interesting to try and unpack the politics of some of Doctor Who's most prolific writers. Robert Holmes, on his surface, might appear to be a little bit of a right-wing reactionary, but when you drill down a little bit, he's quite the opposite. And then Russell T Davies, on the surface, appears to be incredibly progressive and left-leaning. And when you do a closer reading of his stories, he's exactly the opposite. So I want to read to you a little bit from your Black Archive. I've got one passage that I want to talk about with you, and then we'll talk about the structure of the book. I am wrestling with Smudge at home, and she's trying to bite me as my hand goes to turn the page. So I think the cat has other ideas. Here, Smudge, why don't you read this out loud? No, she's just biting me again. She's been fed like 45 minutes ago, so I'm not quite sure what the problem is here, Smudge. The Sunmakers is one of the most political stories of a series that involves journeys into the future. The question as to whether it has prophetic qualities or is merely a period piece from late 70s Britain can therefore be asked. But perhaps that is the wrong framing. It will inevitably have features which reflect the time and place of its making, both in the overt content of its satire and in the structural conditions in which it was made. These are interesting enough for the program to be an insight into the political ideas and images of its time. From conservative complaints about high taxation to the radical chic of armed female revolutionaries, which I hadn't thought about, by the way, until I read that passage, and in the way television was produced in a large bureaucratic organization with wildly variable finances and severe industrial relations problems. But the mere fact that we are discussing this artistic production 45 years after original transmission suggests that there are facets of the Sunmakers which address longer-term questions that are still of interest, and that some of those might be clearer in 2022 than they were in 1977. So you have 6 chapters in the book, and that's typically how the Black Archives works for the sadly uninitiated. Somebody will find 6 or 7 different elements of the story that are worth separate academic discussion. So, and these are primarily based on quotes from the story. An unprofitable operation, Hade, which is my worst on-the-spot Henry Wolf impersonation. The grandest society of merchants in the universe. Sacrifices to tribal gods, which is a great Leela quote that I'll talk about more on the other half of the show. The people should rise up and slaughter their oppressors, Ibid, and praise the company. And then, of course, Chapter 4 is Empire of the Iron Sun, which perhaps relates to the stylized Sunmakers Company motif, which features prominently both on TV and on the cover of your Black Archive. So, what was your way of getting into the Sunmakers for a scholarly text? How did you decide which 6 chapters to discuss?
Well, in the way of these things, academic writers, it's harder to write 5,000 words than 15,000 words. So there were sort of strands that ended up being sort of on the cutting room floor, either mine or the editors who did a very good job of getting it down from about 48,000 to about 40,000. So there's some sort of structural, to some extent, the structure of it was guided by the editors of the text. And the order changed a few times as I wrote it. Now, I don't want to. We could end up with an endless kind of meta series of the making of the Black Archive on the Sunmakers and the making of that. But it struck me that, I mean, there was this sort of a old saw that the only 2 things in life that are inevitable are death and taxes, and there's the overt content about taxation that is there in the Sunmakers. So in a sense, that was where one starts. Is it really about tax? I start the book with, I guess the other thing I started with was I was kind of playing around with sort of Marxism, rather as Bob Holmes plays around with Marxism in writing the Sunmakers. And I thought it would be quite fun and quite sort of in keeping with the Black Archives kind of modus operandi to think about the material conditions in which this thing was produced. That the idea in sort of classic Marxism that sort of the base determines superstructure, and that the kind of culture or the material conditions under which the Sunmakers was written, will have this effect on the nature of the output. And I felt you could see that in a number of ways, both in the ideas and the references that Holmes was doing, because in a sense, the problem with taxation wasn't a problem necessarily with high taxation, although taxation was on personal income was higher in 77 than it is now. Overall burden of taxation was actually a little lower. But it's to do with the relationship of the freelancer and the person whose kind of tax affairs are complicated with the tax authorities that was sort of what caught Robert Holmes and provided some of the anger for that level of it. And yeah, you had this sort of conflictual semi-state bureaucracy. And it was also a moment in broadcasting technological history where you had a number of very skilled professions that were kind of on the edge of great technological change, some of which was going to be bad for their pay and conditions. So, and a lot of the sort of industrial relations problems that struck in broadcasting and the print media in the late 70s, early 80s were about this kind of change in technology and the reduction of skills. And it was something that I guess broadcast technicians faced before a lot of other sort of professions where you could earn a very good wage indeed as a skilled working class technician, and that you can see Bob Holmes's kind of has some sympathy with. He's got a lot of sympathy with for somebody who's supposed to be a conservative. He's got a lot of sympathy with the workers' movement in this, and I feel there is a kind of class struggle in the text of the Sunmakers and the class relations at the BBC, and Holmes's position being sort of ambiguous because he in Marxist terms he controlled the means of production as a freelance writer in a way that other people didn't. So I kind of felt, wouldn't it be fun to kind of do a little bit of a kind of Marxism analysis of this? And it fit in sort of all sorts of surprising ways, like the revolution being very Marxist in its in the way the revolution on Pluto works, and a particular sort of Marxism as well, and the anti-colonialist Frantz Fanon kind of way. So it started off with this idea of sort of bringing Marx and the Sunmakers together, inspired, of course, because the Doctor misquotes Marx rather kind of smugly in the Sunmakers. So I just thought this is a typical kind of Doctor Who formulation in a way. You bring together some sort of incongruous and disparate elements and see what happens. So that, sorry, again, a long description of how I ended up approaching the Sunmakers the way I did.
What I find interesting about the Marxist reading of the story is you do reference Tom Baker's quote in Part 3, nothing to lose but your claims. If we take the novelization as the adaptation of Holmes's final script, and rather than a transcription of the television, because you often had changes made in rehearsal or in studio on the day of that result in a different transmitted product, so the novelization often reflects a slightly older version of the story. In the novelization, the pun is not there. The line is straight up, nothing to lose but your chains. And I'll talk about that more in the other half. So if that comes from Holmes's final script, that is Holmes directly referencing the famous communist principle, or the socialist revolution, I should say, whereas Tom Baker perhaps ad-libs it into a play on words, which is funnier, but maybe dilutes the point slightly.
Yeah, but I think, but also the quote is kind of lampshaded in the text as well. That sort of, I seem to remember that there was a kind of thing about the Doctor feeling pleased with himself saying it, and Tom does look very pleased with himself as in the transmitted version. And so the idea that it's actually a fairly, I mean. I think it is. I mean, the original Marx quote is apposite for the circumstances. Okay, you've got a bit of punning and play with it, and actually that sort of symbolises the whole of the Sunmakers, really. That it is actually quite a serious revolutionary text, but they're having a bit of fun with it as well, and a bit of sort of bit of a joke, bit of sort of self-subversion. But I think there's a deadly serious side to it.
In your book, you reference, of course, a lot of the ongoing behind-the-scenes production strife. This is Graham Williams' first year as producer, and in a large sense, this is quite a downgrade from the Barry Letts and Philip Hinchcliffe eras that immediately preceded. You talk about the budgetary crunch. There could be a debate to be had as to whether or not Graham Williams was a victim of inflation rather than someone who just wasn't very good at managing the budget that he was given, which led to John Nathan Turner being installed in the program. You also talk quite a bit about the historical background of the story, and me coming from across the pond, a lot of that would have been lost on me for most of my life. And in fact, I learned a lot more about the underlying things that Robert Holmes would have seen and done that inspired this story. So you talk, of course, about the East India Company. You talk about Robert Holmes's military service in Asia. And I read this book last year. I was years old when I learned that Salatine, the character from another Holmes story, Caves of Androzani, is not just a random collection of sci-fi syllables, but is actually a name with a deeper historical meaning. You also reference a conversation that you and I had for a different podcast some time ago about Robert Holmes and some of the more unfortunate political aspects of Talons of Wang Chiang, which, of course, is a story worthy of a tremendous amount of debate and discussion. But I was gratified to see that you named me in the acknowledgments to this book, so I'll just get that out of the way as a matter of self-interest.
No, pleasure. I mean, my conversations with you have sort of stimulated the ideas, and there is, very glad to sort of pay my intellectual debts.
You mentioned a bit about Pennant Roberts' direction of the story. I think for a man who is often derided as the director of Warriors of the Deep and Time Lash, this is Pennant Roberts' first work on the show. Season 15 is where you lose a lot of Doctor Who's best directors prior to this point. Douglas Camfield is gone forever. Michael E. Bryant is gone forever. David Maloney is gone forever. So you have a lot of new directors coming in, and some of them have very firm ideas about what they want their show to look like. Michael Hayes, Pennant Roberts. Others don't seem to know what they're doing for parts of the Graham Williams era. And I didn't see Metropolis for the first time until I was in my mid-20s, but Metropolis's influence on this story is unmistakable once you know that it's there. You talk a little bit about the nature of Empire, and you quote other Doctor Who stories along the way. And you talk about the role of the revolutionary. So you have Mandrel and Gaudry and Veed, and that's where the story makes a sharp left turn, pardon the pun, from a screed about high government oppression taxation to the plight of those left behind when capitalism runs amok. So I don't want to, of course, give away all the themes of the book, but I learned a lot from reading this, and it caused me to look at Sunmakers and much more than the surface reading that I'd been doing for most of my life. So we've talked about Cordo. Cordo has the hero's journey. Mandrel, interestingly, has the same journey because he begins the show as an antagonist, a very nasty, hostile man. There is the implication that he is literally getting his candles from the corpses of the people that he's murdered, presumably higher-up company officials. And he steals, cheats, and kills. He threatens horrific violence to Leela, who's our female lead. And then all of a sudden, in part 3, he falls under the Doctor's spell, and he basically leads the technical aspects of the revolution. So it's quite possible that he is going to be the person running the colony now that the Collector has evacuated. What did you think of Mandrel's journey in the story, and how typical is he of Doctor Who's portrayal of revolutionaries?
Well, Mandrel is, you're right. He's an extremely unpleasant figure at the start. And as well as all those failings, he's a physical coward as well.
Yes.
He's not a good man. His conversion is, okay, it's Doctor Who, we're in a hurry. is pretty quick, but he is his criminality, his revolt against the grotty world that he lives in, is given direction and purpose by the revolution, by the Doctor, who is sort of the inspiration here. And also Mandrel discovers his kind of, it's quite interesting that Mandrel, in his role as a kind of gang leader, he's a sort of, he hasn't actually broken away from the company's rules. He is, even his kind of is the idea of making candles from human fat is a kind of restatement of what the Sunmakers thing is, that the company sort of does the same thing, does recycle corpses and so on. He upholds the company's class system in his gang. He sort of he retains his class privileges even as he. And then you see him becoming a more cooperative, egalitarian, constructive revolutionary when the Doctor kind of takes him in hand. And you can also see his accent changing. I mean, it's quite interesting that while he recovers his sort of middle class functionality, he actually also acquires this sort of more genuinely egalitarian, purposeful attitude. And so, yeah, you can imagine him being leader. But I think another sort of couple of things that this character of Mandrel is doing. The underworld people, the undercity people, they're rather like the kind of characters you get in Oliver Twist. That you've got this sort of rather Victorian underworld going on. So you've got that, and with the sort of undertow of really nasty violence that was there as well. And also you've got this William Simons, the actor who played Mandrel, had sort of severe facial scarring. And it's a bit of a Bob Holmes thing again, this sort of facial scarring and moral depravity that you see with sort of people, or at least tragic kind of heroic villains like Sharazek, for instance, or Magnus Greel. But it's restating another kind of trope in the literature, and it goes back. I mean, if you look at the characters of the leaders of the French Revolution, I mean, I identify slightly fancifully Mandrel with Danton, who was sort of scarred and was the kind of who was regarded as an extremist at the start, but was actually kind of pretty, and then was executed later on during the revolution. And I speculate, again, kind of completely going ahead of the text, that at some point perhaps Veidt is going to end up sort of operating the guillotine, and poor old Mandrel's going to be the revolutions will eat its children. Who knows? But anyway, I enjoyed Mandrel, and I thought, actually, I mean, William Simons, although you do have to do a fairly quick turn from being this nasty gang leader to being this progressive revolutionary, I mean, William Simons, I think, does put quite a bit into it. I mean, I've got a lot of time for some of the actors who play some of the parts in this. I think they're terribly good, and it's a bit under. I think it's a bit under appreciated, quite how good the cast are in here.
There are two main changes that Terrence makes to the story in part 4. I will talk about those in more detail on the other side of the break when I do my audio essay, but you go into both of them in the Black Archive, and they both revolve around female characters. Some of this is down to Pennant Roberts, who, at his best, understood that Doctor Who was coming from a world where almost every role was default male. When you go back to season 13, almost every story in season 13 has an all-male cast, with the exception of Elizabeth Sladen. And throughout his entire run on the show, Pennant Roberts goes to a script and says, no, we're going to make this a female role because we're just hiring men.
Mm.
So Marn, I believe, the Gatherer's right hand, who later on becomes a left hand, pardon the pun, she was scripted as male, becomes a female character. I could not find much about Jonina Scott's TV and film career, but I think she gives pretty remarkable performance here in what appears to be an unscripted moment when the Gatherer makes physical contact with her and she turns right to the camera
Yeah.
and gives a wonderful. That is not referenced in the novelization, so you have to imagine that was devised in rehearsal or perhaps on the studio day. Her very last appearance on television is looking nervously to either side of her as she's not sure whether or not the revolution is going to accommodate her. So her fate is very much left open up in the air. So when I first saw this on television, I knew that it immediately had to be the next novelization that I bought because I was desperate to see if the novelization could tell us whether she lived or died. Terrence has his own opinion on that, and it's wonderful. And then you have the character of Veet, who you also talk about in the Black Archive. Now, we already have throughout season 15 a revolutionary character based on a real-life terrorist, although Chris Boucher on the audio commentary to Robots of Death doesn't refer to Leela as a terrorist, refers to her as a freedom fighter based on a real-life figure of a very similar name, who... So in this story, you have two. You have Veet as well, who is a vicious radical revolutionary, and she commits the most shocking, violent act of the story, which on television is showed as a happy, fun time, which ends in cheering. In the book, Terrence, perhaps because he's writing to a much younger audience, sees this in a different way. So talk to us a little bit, if you can, about Veet and where she fits into Robert Holmes and how she interacts with Leela, and whether or not Terrence did the right thing by changing her big moment.
So before Veet Marn, I mean, I'll just sort of add that, like you, I love what Terrence Dix did with Marn at the end. She was a character I liked, and she's funny and clever, and so I'm glad Terrence Dix did that. As far as Marn was concerned, I have very mixed feelings about the way he tweaked the ending as regards Veet and the Gatherer. I went back and forward in my own mind about this, whether it was appropriate to walk back a bit some of the implications of what Robert Holmes and the version that made it to screen were doing. In the end, I decided, okay, fair enough. I actually like the brutal, uncompromising version that went on screen, but for Saturday tea time, it probably was a bit too far for the novelization. I felt at the end that what Holmes was doing was actually quite it's quite realistic. Revolutions are violent. Revolutions do destroy their own, and actually this is the most sort of Frantz Fanon bit of it, that revolutionary violence can be liberating for those taking part in it. I felt what Holmes was doing with the scene where they chucked the Gatherer off the roof was actually the citizens have faced down their own fear and their own demons, and they're now freer people for having committed this act of violence. And I like that as a sort of an adult piece of art. But on the other hand, what Terrence Dix is doing, I think, is giving us a world. I mean, Doctor Who takes liberties with all sorts of scientific laws, let alone sort of social scientific principle. So why can't we have a sort of humanistic revolution? I don't know, and I think it sort of forms part of this sort of dialogue, which I believe in dialectics and so on, and fair enough, the dialogue can go on. Holmes and Dix talk about this actually in the sort of slightly staged script discussion in the Who's Doctor Who documentary that was made at around the same time, and Terence Dix believes in a kind of moral responsibility towards the people who are left behind once the Doctor leaves. And Bob Holmes basically doesn't. And I think you can see that playing out in the way that Dix novelizes Holmes's story. And yeah, I think Terence Dix was probably right. I mean, there are one or two other sort of things that I think I personally really like, but I'm not sure they're proper Doctor Who. Like, the Seeds of Doom, for instance, I think is the Doctor has somehow entered another genre and sort of has an adventure and then leaves and goes back to it being a Doctor Who story. So I think it's great, but I'm not sure it's Doctor Who.
That's an interesting sidestep, though, because I've been saying for a long time that Doctor Who is most things to most people. It's a format that can accommodate everything from the historical to the musical. So I like when Doctor Who breaks its own rules and enters into other genres. Seeds of Doom, which I've already covered on this show, is one of my absolute favorites because it has an interesting vibe. It has amazing performances by Tom Baker and John Challis and Liz Sladen and Tony Beckley
Yeah.
and Hubert Reese. Just everybody in the cast, and not to ignore anybody, but not to ignore anybody by omission. Seeds of Doom is just it's a dark and violent but fun story. And as a kid, I was watching it over and over again, more so than I did the Sunmakers. So I want to speak out in defense of Seeds
Big
of
Green
Doom.
Monster, yeah.
So sorry to interrupt you there, but yeah, I want to speak up for Seeds of Doom whenever I can.
No, quite right. I mean, it is great, and it's very funny, and it does have stuff like a big green monster in it. So I can't remember who said it, but it's somebody said something like the TARDIS is a machine for traveling between genres, and there's something to that. But I felt that Seeds of Doom was sort of traveling to the edge, or maybe slightly beyond of what you can do. And Sunmakers likewise. It's a German expressionist adult political satire in a Doctor Who story, and that about violent revolution and taxes. And you have to. I mean, it is going to the edge of what a children's program can do.
And it's fascinating that it comes out in 1977, which is 50 years after Metropolis is made, long after Fritz Lang passes away. But 1977 is the year of Metropolis because not only is the set design of the factory incorporated into the Gatherer's office, but the literal robot from Metropolis is put on the big screen in the form of Anthony Daniels' C-3PO.
Oh, yes.
Now, Star Wars would have been made about a year before Sunmakers, and there was already a Star Wars influence on Doctor Who, with Leslie Schofield going direct from Pinewood to TC3 to make Face of Evil immediately after Star Wars wraps. And then you have, of course, the opening sequence to Invisible Enemy, which is hard to look at as anything but Doctor Who being in conversation with George Lucas. So that's the Sunmakers as breaking genres. Now, obviously, we all bring our own preferences and idiosyncrasies to our shows. I am always on the wary lookout for anti-Semitism in Doctor Who. William Hartnell, the original Doctor, was, of course, described as anti-Semitic by a couple of people. But if you look at the show that he made with a Jewish producer, and if you look at the number of Jewish refugee actors who settled in England and became performers and did great work in the Hartnell era of the show, which is a significant amount of the guest cast during the Hartnell years, it's hard to feature that because this is who William Hartnell would have been working for and with and alongside, and it doesn't seem to have caused the problems that some of the more negative stories that have been spread in later years would seem to suggest. You and I, in the original conversation that we had on the other podcast, talked about the one anti-Semitic character in Holmes's own Towns of Weng Chiang. Henry Wolfe is another Jewish actor who shows up and plays the villain in this story, and in some ways it could be seen, I'm afraid, as a caricature because he's called a Usuri, and that's literally the name. It's the Terry Nation school of naming your alien race after their one immutable characteristic. And he plays the character as hunched over and small and obsessed with money. And similar to the way that Mrs. Samuelson is described in London's 1890s East End in Towns of Weng Chiang as a bloodsucker, the Doctor also literally calls him, the Collector, a blood-sucking leech. So I forgive both stories because I find Talons and Sunmakers tremendously entertaining on the whole, and I'm just in awe of Robert Holmes's writing style. I am now, I think, about as old as Holmes would have been in 1976-77, if not a little bit older or younger. He has writing skills that I will never have, no matter how much I try and study and aim. I do worry about those aspects to his story. Can the Collector be read as an anti-Semitic character, or is it just a science fiction a bit of somebody trying to be weird and funny at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I had some mixed feelings about that. I mean, my take at the end was that it's certainly, again, sort of product of its time, and I don't mean that in the sense that it reflects overt racist attitudes that were commonplace at the time. I don't believe necessarily in acquittal. It's a different sort of defense in that I think probably looking at it now, there would be somebody in a script conference or whatever who would say, hang on, are we dealing with material that's sort of a bit mucky? And in the way television was made at that time and the way sort of stereotypes were used in a variety of sort of social settings, there was less consideration. It was made by, I mean, as you correctly note, it was broadcasting was a world in which Jewish people were represented. It's a world in which gay people were represented as well. So there's possibly more of a conversation in the production room about some of these matters than there was about sort of racial stereotypes about black people, which I think there are some horrific, probably mostly unintentional examples in the early series. Now, I think the way Holmes worked in particular was that he sort of sucked up a kind of, he wrote pastiche and sucked up, I mean, this is probably the standard defense of Talons of Weng Chiang, and I don't wish to kind of entirely acquit Weng Chiang because there are nasty things about it.
And I'll point out, this is the sort of conversation that got my show described as a ghastly woke zombie on Apple Podcasts last week. Buy the T-shirt.
Wear the T-shirt with pride. I mean, that Holmes sort of sucks up pastiche and reprocesses it, and some of the pastiche material for Weng Chiang, he sort of Fu Manchu and so on. I mean, it is, let's face it, is racist. I think with the Collector, the genesis of it is a bit different in that the original sort of version of it was as a sort of gang, a sort of an extortion racket leader. That the idea was to portray a kind of hierarchy with the Mr. Big at the top, and the reference was Hitchcock. Now, this didn't happen, and to what extent also, I mean, one can't get far into the sort of discussions that actors, directors, writers had about these things. To what extent it was Henry Wolfe that was whose ideas were reflected in the way the Collector was done, I don't know. I mean, I think the costume and so on some people have said it was sort of trying to evoke oil sheikhs. I can't see that myself. It just looks like a standard kind of bureaucratic business sort of costume.
And Terrence mentions that in the novelization, talking about the pinstripe suit as the badge of big business for millennia.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of it's very much the sort of 1970s kind of reference to sort of big business executives. The little handkerchief in his pocket,
Yes.
the eyebrows, the spiky eyebrows, were a reference to Dennis Healy. I think what Henry Woolf was doing with the voice in particular was this sort of, I describe it as this, I think as this sort of, is this, I'm not sure how Terence Dix describes it in the book. I mean, you probably know better than I, but it's this sort of strained kind of time is money kind of voice. And I don't feel that there's I feel it, I understand that people's sort of interpretations were I feel it's kind of just about clear enough of being of channeling anti-Semitism, but I mean, I feel that also the source material. It's a danger you've got to actually think about when you write things about. Okay, you've got a little alien who's the kind of manipulator of the humans and so on, and is fascinated by money. I mean, it's obvious pitfalls that you can fall in. I mean, I feel it sort of must be permissible to write that kind of story, but I think there are duties on writers to avoid kind of real world correlates, and I'm not going to say that Holmes thought about his duty in that respect, or even that writers generally did at that stage. I kind of feel that, I mean, I listened to Henry Woolf do an interview with Toby Haydock about his participation. And what struck me is quite what a bright guy Woolf was. He was thinking about what he was doing. So, I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone what to think about this, to be honest. It's not my place. Woolf liked it. Woolf liked it 40 years later. Woolf is a bright political kind of guy whose Jewish identity is obviously part of him. Yeah, I'm not going to tell it. Sorry, I mean, I'm that's a very, very sort of halting way of talking about it. But I feel that it was risky material, and you probably shouldn't play with risky material like that without thinking about it more than they did at the time.
And I'll give Terrence the last word on this. Terrence, we've talked about this before, intentionally removed an anti-Semitic caricature from the 1960s story, The Web of Fear. This novelization comes out. It's the second to last Tom Baker novelization. It's after Peter Davison has already taken over the lead role. We've already had one Peter Davison novelization by this point in the line, and the rest of them are coming hard on its heels. So Tom Baker is not on the cover anymore. This is J&T saying no past Doctors on the covers. So Henry Woolf gets the cover illustration. And it's a little bit obscured by the neon tube logo, which is enormous, but you have the 6 sons of Pluto over his head. And the eyebrows are done by Andrew Skilleter in absolutely realistic fashion to both Dennis Healy and the costume department. Terrence does not tell us in the book, at least in the opening scene on pages 40 and 41, what the collector sounds like, but this is the description. The collector himself was even more extraordinary. To begin with, he was tiny, almost a dwarf, with a huge bald head that seemed meant for a much larger man. He wore the traditional pinstripe suit reserved for those of highest rank. It was a severe one-piece garment in navy blue with thin white stripes, a square of white cloth in the breast pocket. Its origins were lost in antiquity, although it was believed that the costume dated back to the days of old Earth. That's Terrence definitely enjoying himself as he writes. Back to the book. Page 41, the collector crouched in a huge wheeled chair behind his desk, since his nose was always a few inches from the computer printouts and calculator control consoles that covered his desk. Calculator control consoles covered. It's perhaps carrying alliteration a bit too far. Visitors usually found themselves addressing the dome of the great bald head. And that's the best description of the collector that we get, and then you refer back to the Andrew Skilleter cover painting for the rest. So if there was anything negative intended about the collector in Robert Holmes's pen and typewriter, definitely does not come across in the book, thankfully.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our talk about the Sunmakers. We're about to transition into our weekly game. But anything else you want to say about your Black Archive or the editorial process? I'll point out that your book came out very close in time to the Black Archive on Talons of Wang Chiang. And Dale Smith has also been a guest on this show, a terrific guy. On page 2, on the copyright page, this is probably a cut and paste error from the main computers. You are given the copyright of the text. Paul Driscoll and Stuart Douglas are the editors. And then it says on page 2 of your book, Dale Smith has asserted his right to be identified as the author of this work.
Yeah, I noticed that. That is a glitch. If Dale Smith could reassign that at some point, that would be great. But I don't think we're going to be. I don't think the courts are going to be hearing from anyone involved about this. Yeah, I mean, it is a remarkable series, and it's sort of unity and diversity. I think it must be a struggle for the editors to kind of impose any kind of uniformity on it, and with people have lots of different takes, interpretations, and methods. I mean, I can't think of anything quite like it. I mean, please do read them first about the stories that you're interested in and love, and then about stories perhaps you don't care for, because sometimes even those are kind of interesting. Like there's this class of Doctor Who story that sort of starts in the Colin Baker era, where the making of documentaries are more watchable than the actual episodes, and there probably are stories where the Black Archive is more interesting than the broadcast version. I mean, I'm unambiguously fond of the Sunmakers, and I still am after having written about it and lived in that little world for a bit. I think it's a surprisingly kind of rich text, really. I think what I would say about it is that the East India Company subtext is very strong, and indeed a lot of the sort of language of it, like the collector and the gatherer and so on, is comes from that. A lot of the absurdity of taxation. I mean, as you identify, most of the chapter headings are quotations from the from dialogue, but one of them is also the most magnificent set of merchants in the universe. That was actually what somebody in a contemporary called the East India Company, and I just thought that was quite interesting. And the East India Company and then the Raj did work through oppressive taxation. It was the soldier and the tax collector sort of despoiled Bengal and then the rest of India. And until late in the Raj, you still have the salt tax. I mean, an attempt to kind of extract money from people kind of panning for salt from a salty sea on their doorstep. And you got some foreign kind of enterprise coming in and sort of asking for money when people do that. And the reality of taxation in sort of company India and the Raj was not greatly less absurd than it is on Pluto in the Sunmakers. I think some of this has been lost in a lot of discussion about it. That actually we tend to that there was a period when we tended to think also of the idea of companies as governments as being a bit of a sort of science fiction type idea, and it's not. It's actually history, and the history of the early company years in Bengal is worse in some ways than you see on Pluto. And one of the things I loved about, I mean, I mentioned some of the performances. I loved the costume design of Gatherer Haid. I think that was beautiful. It also makes one of the jokes about sort of humbug pay off, and it's also this very witty kind of evocation of the idea of a nabob, somebody who kind of someone of the British who went to kind of over to exploit India and got rich out of the East India Company and came back with all these kind of pretensions and pomposity and a complete sort of misunderstanding of the culture. And that Haid represents this figure from sort of history and literature, the nabob. And I loved that when I found out about it. And I just love the way Richard Leach kind of realizes Haid, this sort of absolutely pompous fool. And whereas the collector's villainy is kind of large, he's a sort of cackling sadist, Haid is mediocre, and he's villainous on a kind of rather human scale. We all probably work with people like that, and that makes it all the more shocking when he has kind of this violent end. I mean, like, he's the sort of villain who sometimes gets to the end of a Doctor Who series, a reformed character or not too badly off, and he gets killed in quite a real life way. And Haid's just sort of shocked, not so much in fear of his life, but Leach brings out this sort of, what on earth are these people doing? How dare they? Attitude. I mean, it's a great script. There's fantastic ideas and references in it, but also possibly I didn't say enough in the book, how good the actors are. Yeah.
So let's move on to our game of Guess That Cliffhanger, which we're going to play this week for the first time in a while. I have selected at random 3 individual classic series Doctor Who episode endings anywhere between 1963 and 1989, which is different from my 20 questions game, which takes the entirety of Doctor Who. And this is from episodegenerator.com. That's all one word, episode generator /Doctor-Who-old. I will now play our first clip.
You see, just think what this could do for our mining program, our processing, packaging, dozens of labour jobs, Governor. It may even supply the end to all this colony's problems.
Yes, it will end the colony's problems because it will end the colony.
I am your servant.
It spoke. Kathy, did you hear it? It could actually talk.
It do many things, Lesson. But the thing it does most efficiently is exterminate human beings.
Servant.
It destroys them without mercy, without conscience.
I
destroys them utterly, completely.
Destroys them. I am your servant.
So that is drawn at random, but it is quite possibly one of the most famous and best done Doctor Who cliffhangers ever. For 2 points, can you name the story and which episode in the story it concludes?
Well, it's the power of the Daleks, and it's early on because you were setting it up, so it's either 1 or 2. 1.
Definitely is Power of the Daleks. It's kind of a dead giveaway. And I think we're both almost struggling with trying to say Power of the Doctor instead of Power of the Daleks. It would not be Part 1. Part 1 was depicted in telesnaps in the hardcover book Doctor Who, the early years, which ends with the discovery of the Dalek prop.
So, yeah, I mean, its front end of the story, isn't it? I mean, it's 2 or 3, 2.
All right, so I'll give you 1 point. It is, in fact, the end of episode 2. 4 points win, so you're still on track. It is just an absolutely bonkers cliffhanger to listen to. It is just so well done on all around. And that's, speaking of the great Doctor Who directors, that was Christopher Barry. So let's move on to our next one.
You fool! He could have told us where Omega is!
Omega?
Put up your weapon, Castellan.
The Doctor is a traitor.
Hedin is your traitor.
Lord President, we must shut down the Matrix.
It won't prevent transfer.
No, but it could delay it. Give us time to hunt Omega down.
Doctor!
It's too late. Omega controls the Matrix.
That is your second clue. Can you name the story? I guess the story is also kind of a dead giveaway.
The story is not probably difficult. It's Arc of Infinity.
Absolutely.
And it must be... It's late in the narrative. I'd say the end. I'd say that it's 2 or 3.
Yes, it is. It is, in fact, end of part 3. My first cliffhanger, actually, was Arc of Infinity part 2. And I don't recall if I saw part 3 the next night, but if I did, this would have been my second Doctor Who cliffhanger. All right, and now we're going to move on to the third clue, which is directed by a director whose excellent Doctor Who work we referenced earlier in the program.
No, I'll be right over. And Sarah...
Better keep his recovery dark for the moment.
Why? Do you think Harry's still in danger from something?
Again, the story is kind of a dead giveaway based on the visual.
Yeah.
Can you guess which episode part it is?
Gotta love a rubbery orange arm, yeah. That's I recognise Zygon body parts. I mean, this is what is Terror of the Zygons, or the Loch Ness Monster in novelisation parlance.
Yes.
And okay, you've got the Harry thing. Yeah, we're a fair way into the narrative now, but we're not near the resolution of the story. So I'd say this is the end of episode 2.
It was the first reveal of the Zygon, and that's a fair guess, because typically with these rubber monsters, you can't have them in studio too much because the costumes are just incredibly uncomfortable to wear. So normally the big monster reveal in the classic series is halfway through the serial, but in this case... it is actually part 1. Part 2 is where the Doctor's being chased by the... Speaking of unconvincing enormous monsters, the Doctor is being chased by a...
he's chased by the Scarrison across the moor, yeah.
A split-screen hand in a rubber glove going chomp, chomp, chomp.
Because, the narrative shifts for part 3, doesn't it? And
then part 4 takes place in London rather than Scotland. Yeah. But you get 4 points.
Scraped in.
So you are a winner. Nobody has lost this game yet. It is definitely fun to chase down the clips and watch them with you and try and get you. The stories are normally obvious, but people have more trouble, I guess, with the which episode part is it. But you have a passing grade, so Lewis, congratulations.
Thank goodness for them.
Anything else you have coming up on the horizon that you want to pitch, or where else can we find you online?
I'm at sort of, if Twitter still exists at the time the time you publish your podcast, I am sort of Lewis Baston 5 talking about Doctor Who. I'm Lewis_Baston talking about politics and general rants, and I'm also Baston Borders, which will be my next book, which is about the sort of history, folklore, current sort of things about European borders and Russian invasion of Ukraine and the history of the Second World War and so on. So there's all that going on. In the longer term, there may be further Doctor Who news. So I'll keep you posted when I can say more.
Speaking of cliffhangers, that is a tantalizing cliffhanger on which to leave us. Lewis, we will try. We actually Amazingly, I am nearly done booking this show, even though I'm only about halfway through the targets. We are going to try and have you back on, and I will, of course, promote any of your other future projects that come out during the life of this podcast, which has probably about 18 months to go until I run out of target books to discuss. So, Lewis, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. We'll talk real soon.
Likewise, Jason. Thank you so much. Great pleasure talking to you. Take care.
Doctor Who and the Sunmakers. That's one word. By Terrence Dix. Televised as The Sunmakers. That's two words. Well, no, check that. That's three words. Teleplay by Robert Holmes. Televised in November and December 1977. Published in November 1982. Cover artist Andrew Skilleter. Everyone knows that Pluto is a barren, airless rock. So naturally, the Doctor is surprised when he discovers artificial suns, an ultra-modern industrial city, and a group of colonists being worked and taxed to death in this inhospitable and supposedly undeveloped part of the universe. With the help of his companion Leela and the faithful K9, the Doctor takes on the mysterious and powerful company, ruthless exploiter of planets and their people. Inhospitable? 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 Sorry, never going to be able to get it right. Moving on. Last week, during episode 72, my guest, John Blum, and I discussed opening sentences, specifically the kind of direct, you are there, slam-bang opening sentences of Terrence Dix versus the more abstract but clever and predictive opening sentence of Christopher H. Bidmead in last week's book, the novelization of Logopolis. John pointed out that he and Kate Orman, went with that kind of opening, which previews the theme of the story in their 1997 novel Vampire Science. This is great writing. But then we jump ahead to the very next published Target novel after Logopolis, and there's a banger of a Terrence opening so good that it seems unfair to try and suggest that Bidmead does it any better. In a drab and featureless corridor, a drab and featureless man stood waiting before a shuttered hatch. We've been on a run of really strong Season 18 novelizations. David Fisher's The Leisure Hive, or The Leisure Hive for those of you in the UK, Andrew Smith's Full Circle, Stephen Gallagher's Warrior's Gate, Bidmead's Logopolis. Experimental yet lyrical books that play around with their source material, and in the last of those literally kills off your main character. Tom Baker is, in November 1982, not just a former TV doctor, but now his TV doctor's death is already flying off the shelves. Jumping back over 3 years in time to a Robert Holmes script with Leela and K9 is a real record-scratch moment. Kind of like when, in the spring of 1985, my PBS station showed Horror of Fang Rock out of order on consecutive nights, showing Part 4 the night after Part 3, leading to my confusion when Alan Rowe's character was still alive, and I briefly thought that the story was the Doctor going back in time halfway through to save the dead. It's weird going back to a rather simple Terrence, 4th Doctor Graham Williams era romp, after this run of experimental books, and after Tom Baker regenerated into a, quote, vacuous young face, TM, Christopher H. Bidmead, just 1 month earlier. But Terrence's deceptively simple writing pulls me effortlessly back in, even before the Season 15 TARDIS team. Remember Season 15, the year that Tom spends 15% of his time fondling the TARDIS console, shows up. Paragraph 2. He had been waiting for a very long time, the dull, nagging ache of sorrow filling his heart. Even D-grade citizens have feelings, though they seldom show them. Cordo's father was dying. I mean, wow, that's good. Cordo's wallet is filled with, quote, painfully accumulated low-value metal tokens. Dude, I'm ready to rise up and revolt against the Gatherer, and it's only the second page of the book. Quote, like all lower-grade citizens, he, Cordo, lived in a world of metal and plastic and artificial light. Chapter 1, by the way, is titled The Cost of the Golden Death, which is awesome. It's a Conan Doyle short story title, the kind of Conan Doyle short story about a different Holmes than the one who scripted this serial. Robert Holmes, as a Doctor Who scriptwriter, was sharp-witted at best and sometimes unbearably caustic at his worst. Part 1 of The Sunmakers on TV, where the Doctor tells both Leela and K9 to shut up, has a pretty rough TARDIS scene. About as bad as how Holmes had the Doctor treat poor Jo Grant in her first outing, Episode 1 of Terror of the Autons. In this book, the shut up to Leela reads as keep quiet, and the same line to K9 is given the editorial adverb rudely. This is a theme we'll work with over the rest of the essay, how Terence, who commissioned some of Holmes's best scripts and then trained him as successor script editor, uses the book to have a conversation with some of Holmes's worst tendencies. Terence also takes us inside Leela's head in clever embellishments. In Chapter 1, Terence has her mistake the Doctor's game of chess with K9 for a religious ritual that's vital to the operation of the TARDIS. In Chapter 2, she likens the Gatherer to, quote, no doubt the monster to which sacrifices had to be made, a kind of primitive Zoanon. As this is the Doctor Who Literature podcast, I always keep an eye out for stray literary references. Terence likes to slip in Shakespeare quotes and Casablanca quotes, especially in his post-Target Doctor Who fiction. Last week we discussed quite a bit about how Christopher H. Bidmead worked Paradise Lost, both its meter and its themes, into the narrative of Logopolis. Here on page 17, as he's about to attempt suicide from the roof of Megropolis 1's tallest building, Terence writes of Cordo, Cordo stared down into the abyss. That has got to be a Nietzsche reference. Got to be. However, the line on page 33 about K9 tracking the Doctor and Leela with, quote, dogged persistence is not literature, just a pretty horrible dad joke. The Sunmakers on TV has a clever story structure. Cordo's attempt to throw himself off the roof in Part 1, setting up the Gatherer's fate of being thrown off that same roof in Part 4. Leela's observation that the citizens should rise up and slaughter their oppressors also gives away the resolution. Terence leans into the structure on page 22 by noting that Marn, the Gatherer's humble assistant, is, quote, shocked to her conformist core by rule-breaking. Stick around for the rest of this essay, and we'll see what Terence does to Marn's conformist core. The line on page 37 about Marn finding the idea of rebellion, quote, utterly terrifying, pays off in just the same way later on. Back in episode 37 of this podcast, the Talons of Wang Chiang episode, we talked about Terence's tendency to soften up the rougher edges of Robert Holmes's language. We possibly discussed the same thing back in episode 33, The Brain of Morbius, two earlier examples of Terence adapting Robert Holmes's scripts for the Target line. In Chapter 4 here, I did find myself somewhat surprised to see Terence retain Holmes's scripted description of Leela, Termagant, which Merriam-Webster describes as, quote, an overbearing or nagging woman, synonym shrew. If you're wondering why I just quoted the Merriam-Webster definition rather than the OED definition, it's because the former is free online, whereas the Oxford English Dictionary is a $100 annual subscription, and as Doctor Who Literature is and always will be a free, non-monetized podcast, yeah, I'm just not going to be subscribing. On page 55, after Leela learns that the fear she feels is chemically induced via the PCM gas, Terence has her think, if the fear was not the result of her own weakness, but of some magic of her enemies, then she would simply disregard it. Pages 56 into 57, Terence has the Doctor size up Gatherer Haid, correctly, within seconds. Quote, the Doctor smiled and said nothing, studying the fantastically overdressed figure before him. A senior bureaucrat, he guessed, cunning and experienced, status-conscious, but without the strength to wield real power. There would be someone behind Gatherer Haid, someone far tougher, and far more intelligent. End quote. This, for me, is the real value of Terence's writing. Razor-sharp character insights, given in just a line or two of text, in between transcribed TV dialogue. As much as John and I talked last week about how Season 18 novelization authors like Bidmead and Andrew Smith and Stephen Gallagher raised the stakes as far as Target's prose style, I still think that Terrence's constant, brief editorial remarks make him the equal of more polished and metaphorical prose.
Ah, Citizen Doctor, welcome. Come in, sit down.
Thank you.
No, please. Yes. Citizen Doctor.
Yes.
An unusual name.
Yes, especially for an Ajax.
Indeed. There's so many Wergs and Keeks and Megropolis 3, I sometimes wonder how my distinguished colleague, Gatherer Pyle, manages to keep track of you all.
Indeed. But how very clever of you to know my name.
Oh, it's here, in your concept card. The cause of your unfortunate experience, from which I trust there are no ill effects.
Oh, no, not at all. Your guards were entirely charming and so attentive.
I am gratified. I brought you here, Citizen Doctor. First of all, to give you the 1,000 Talmars you requested, and also to apologize for any inconvenience. To err is computer.
To forgive is fine.
And there is a second scene between the Doctor and the Gatherer and Marn, which runs about 90 seconds, 2 scenes after the scene that I just played. I'm not going to play the audio for that. I do, of course, encourage you to watch the episode again if you have not already watched it in preparation for this episode. But what fascinates me most about that second scene is the set of the Gatherer's office. It is consciously designed to resemble the enormous factory from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which begs the question, in a world as tightly monetarily controlled as Pluto is under the company, why are there so many employees, played by non-speaking extras, whose job it is to stand around enormous dials and other sculptures in Gatherer Hade's office, contributing nothing visible to the economy of Pluto? It's gorgeous set design, but it is an interesting feature, and Terrence, of course, does not include any of the Metropolis references in the novelization, which was probably based on a rehearsal or draft script before all that stuff entered the episode design. I also just realized, by the way, that Robert Holmes gave us a Kondo in Season 13 and Cordo here in Season 15. And I do remember Gatherer Hade's use of the term Morton's Fork in Part 2 on TV, Chapter 6 in the book. But at the time that I first saw and read the episode, 1985 or so, I just assumed this was a bit of Holmes's characteristic world building by apocryphal continuity references, no different from the surfeit of Wergs and Keeks who drove Gatherer Pyle so crazy in Megropolis 3. But no, Morton's Fork is an actual thing, which I would have learned when the Sunmakers DVD infotext came out, would have forgotten it, and then learned about it again via the finale of the 2014 season of Noah Hawley's Fargo, the TV series, one of the best TV series of all time, as sure as they call me the Breakfast King of Loyola. And that season finale is also titled Morton's Fork. I'll pause here at the halfway point of the book to salute some bits of company improv that, again, like the Metropolis design, did not work their way into the novelization. The Doctor leaving a straight-jacketed Bisham his bag of jelly babies, Jonina Scott's furious Me Too double take into the camera, as Gatherer Hade uses his own personal Morton's Fork to poke her in the belly, and the Doctor reciting his favorite fairy tale, the one about the 3 sisters, seen also in the Android Invasion, when being interrogated by Mandrill in the final scene of Part 2. Chapter 7 is based on very strong TV material which strongly resembles the 3-episode Narkina 5 Prison Foundry arc on Season 1 of Star Wars Andor. The realization that there are a lot more prisoners than guards, a lot more, and not nearly enough guards to overcome a determined and unified prisoner force. There's an even stronger Nazi analogy in the Sunmakers, where all citizens are forcibly tattooed at birth to mark them by permanent scarring as company property. There are 2 differences in this material in the book, both in dialogue. The Doctor in the book describes Gatherer Hade's apology to him as, quote, unlikely, A stronger expression is used on TV, and this exchange, from Part 3,
And what have we got to lose?
Only your claims.
in the book is the far more pedestrian, only your chains, indicating the TV line could be a Tom Baker invention, rather than scripted by Holmes. For a TV story, where it was briefly suggested that Leela could be killed off in Part 4, see the DVD info text for more details, Terence has the Doctor strongly preoccupied with the possibility that Leela, captured during the resolution to the Part 2 cliffhanger, might already be dead. Page 74, quote, the most effective way to free Leela would be to overturn the repressive society which held her prisoner, and the Doctor had decided to do just that. If Leela was still alive, a revolution offered the best hope of rescue. If she was dead, it would be a fitting revenge. And page 77, quote, if Leela was dead, it would be an empty vengeance at best, yet it was worth doing, decided the Doctor. A society that had driven someone like Cordo to climb onto that parapet deserved to be overthrown. Of course, we never learn just what the citizens, slaves, of Pluto are building for the company. Andor, Season 1, provides a very satisfying answer to just what the prisoners are building on in Arcana 5. And for one more Star Wars analogy, Haid was as foolish to let the Doctor go as Darth Vader was to convince Governor Tarkin to not shoot down the Millennium Falcon as it escaped the Death Star. Both rebellions would never win if those decisions are not made. On page 79, Terence takes Holmes' instance of the word Tellurian on TV, one of Holmes' favorite recurring words, and replaces it with, more simply, the word Earth. Gatherer Haid is an inherently ridiculous character, but remembering that I first saw this story at age 11, Richard Leach's performance was perfectly geared toward my age group. The Gatherer gets a range of wonderful dialogue, Holmes using him as basically an external hard drive to catalog every over-the-top superlative he can think of. The Gatherer is to laudatory words what Morbius and Professor Solon were to insults in the brain of Morbius. Terence, as Holmes' counterpart in 72, knows of course exactly what Haid is about and editorializes whenever he can. Page 103, sing adoration to our company, quavered Haid. Terence writes, quote, but no one took any notice, end quote. More on page 109, Terence relishing his knowledge of antiquity, quote, in ancient times the bearer of bad news was slain, and Haid, unfortunately for him, was in a very similar position. The collector needed a scapegoat, and Haid was the nearest. Chapter 10 also shows, in relief by its absence, what improv comedy Tom brought to rehearsal and studio. Captured security guards are tied up with electrical flex in the book, i.e. via Holmes' scripts, but on TV they're tied up with handcuffs that Tom just so happens to store in his capacious pockets, to coin a phrase. On page 114, Terence reflects on Roy McCready's performance, or Robert Holmes' script that led to the same, and has Mandrill tell us, rather than tell us via Omniscient Observer, quote, Mandrill looked at Cordo and smiled wryly to himself, thinking of the terrified little degrade who had been thrust into his hideout. Who would believe that this militant revolutionary was the same man? Still, a lot of things had changed on Megropolis 1 since the arrival of the Doctor. End quote. Later on the same page, Terence wryly acknowledges that Hackett is played on TV by a non-speaking extra. Quote, Hackett just nodded. He had always been a work unit of few words. One thing on TV that has always stayed with me from age 11 onward is that Marn, played so well by Janina Scott, is left up in the air, last seen attempting to join the revolution, by handing her blaster over to a pack of revolutionaries. It's easy to imagine in Robert Holmes' cynical world that she was shot down in cold blood 0.47 seconds after the camera cuts away. Now Terence, who certainly was not sentimental about keeping characters alive, see Fang Rock, Horror of, from the same TV season, decides to give Marn a happy ending. And I love it. Page 115, quote, Marn drew her blaster and leveled it, but the little band of revolutionaries marched cheerfully on. Suddenly Marn realized it was hopeless. She could kill one, perhaps many of them, but the rest would pull her down. And even if she escaped this time, there would be other bands. Just like the mighty company itself, she was helpless in the face of such unity. Reversing her blaster, she held it out and offered it to the sturdy work unit leading the band. "Citizens, I elect to join the revolution." There was a moment of confused silence. Then the man took the blaster and thrust it in his belt, slapped Marn on the back, and ran on. Marn was borne ahead by the group of cheering, shouting revolutionaries. Soon she was cheering and shouting herself. Down with the company! It was, she decided, rather enjoyable. In the very next section, however, Terence makes another significant change to the text. Here is the TV audio.
You there! What are you scum doing up here? This is an abominable crime, an outrage. Leave here at once, you hear me?
It's the gatherer! It's the gatherer!
I order you to leave. You'll pay dearly. Keep back! Don't you dare! I'm an official of the company!
Let him come on! And we'll do the same to the collector when we find him, won't we, citizens?
Showing revolutionaries cheerfully murdering the face of the regime is not something Terence evidently wants in books going out to 11-year-olds. Page 117, final 3 paragraphs. "We'll do the same to the collector when we find him, eh, citizens?" shouted Veit. Most of them turned away in disgust. The crowd shuffled off the roof, a bit shamefaced. There was a general feeling things had got out of hand, gone a bit too far. But there wasn't very much that they could do about it now. From the top of a 1,000-meter building, it's a very long way down. End of chapter 11. Chapter 11, The Gatherer Goes Bankrupt. Actually, no, it's chapter 11, The Confrontation. Terence doesn't need to add much to the final chapter. Just let Holmes's sizzling dialogue play out between the collector and the doctor. I will not play the audio here. We've already played several scenes, but again, very, very good work between Henry Wolfe and Tom Baker. The big difference is that the TV ends with the doctor promising to finish his game of chess with K9, where the book ends with the doctor intentionally upending the board and being very non-committal as to whether or not he ever intends to resume the game. Terence also makes clear the guard commander, a tertiary bad guy for much of the story, has joined the revolution, a detail not made explicit on TV, unless you were paying attention to where the commander was pointing his prop gun when the collector ordered him to, quote, "Arrest these idiots." And yes, my Henry Wolfe impression is not nearly as good as my awful Janet Fielding impression last week. I really should hire somebody else to do these impressions for me. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, well, all good things come to an end. We conclude our run of Season 18 Tom Baker Classics. There is one more Season 18 Tom Baker story yet to be novelized, but it is not, by most standards, a classic. We are going back to the Peter Davison era. We are jumping ahead to Season 19 for our second novelization of a Peter Davison story. The commissioning editor of the Target line looked around in satisfaction at the Season 19 offerings and said, "I've got a great idea. The second Peter Davison story that we're going to sell is Time Flight." Next week, one of my most frequent and funniest guests is going to join us. I will attempt to say good things about Time Flight, the novelization. I will attempt to be charitable to Time Flight, the television episode. I somehow have a suspicion that my guest next week is not nearly going to be as charitable to Time Flight as your host here is as charitable to the Dominators. And somewhere in that reference is a clue. Next week on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. This podcast is produced by David Barsky, Jim Sangster, and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Louis Baston, author of Black Archive number 60, The Sunmakers. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.